Well, we don't have a lot of time, and instead of you listening to my comments on the interesting presentation, I'd rather listen to, I think we'd all rather listen to your reactions, and I'll try to respond if I can. So why don't we go straight into that? I can't see a lot with the light back there, so... Ah, that's better. Okay, so anybody who wants to break the ice, please proceed.
Can I start?
Sure.
I'd like to basically listen to your opinion about this, the conflict in Iraq, the U.S. and Iraqi conflict.
Right now?
Your personal opinions about this.
Well, short comment. I mean, the U.S. goal in Iraq is transparent. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to suppress it, but we all know what it is. If Iraq had been in Central Africa, the U.S. wouldn't have invaded. I mean, it certainly didn't have anything to do with stopping atrocities. So, for example, probably 4 million people have been killed in the eastern Congo in the last couple of years. It didn't have anything to do with bringing democracy. All we have to do is look at the, actually, you don't have to listen to me. If you want to know the answer to that, take a look at the scholar activists who are most prominent in calling for what they call democracy promotion. So the chair of the Carnegie Endowment program on law and democracy, Thomas Carruthers, well-known scholar, calls himself a neo-Reaganite, very dedicated to the cause of democracy promotion, working for one of the major liberal organizations on it. He just came out with a book on democracy promotion since the end of the Cold War, goes through till the end of 2004. And he points out, he says it's been hasn't worked out the way he wanted. He says what he discovers is what he calls a strong line of continuity running through every U.S. administration. Every U.S. administration promotes democracy when it's in the strategic and economic interest of the United States, and it opposes democracy when it's not in the strategic and economic interest of the United States. And he says every administration is somehow schizophrenic. It's kind of like psychic disorder. We have to send them all to a mass mental health hospital and see what's wrong with them. There's a simpler explanation, but if you're a right-thinking intellectual, you're not allowed to come up with it. He also predicts the same in Iraq. He says he regrets it, but he predicts the same in Iraq, and it didn't take long for that prediction to come true. As you recall, when the U.S. and Britain invaded, the single question, it's the phrase that was used, the single question stressed by Bush, Powell, Rice, Blair, Straw, everyone else, is will Iraq stop producing its weapons of mass destruction? That was the single question. And that remained the single question. In fact, in England it still is, which is why there's a hassle over the illegality of the war. Here there's no hassle over the illegality of the war. It's reported that they're doing it in England, but not discussed here because it's just taken for granted in U.S. culture that the U.S. Political culture, elite culture, not the popular culture, that the U.S. has the right to violate any law it wants. So there can't be any question about illegality. I'm talking now about elite culture. Popular culture is radically different, demonstrably. So the single question was, will Iraq stop developing its weapons of mass destruction? Well, after about a year or so, that story collapsed. So it turned out that the single question was what the liberal Boston Globe calls George Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq, if not the world. And just like North Korea, the entire intellectual class immediately shifted with virtually no exceptions. Try to find an exception. No, yeah, it wasn't the weapons of mass destruction. That was not the question. It was Bush's messianic vision. There are critics There are people who say, yes, the Messianic vision is noble and generous, but perhaps it's beyond our means. The Iraqis are too barbaric. They're not up to, we can't bring it to them. They're not ready for democracy, but it's a noble and generous vision. If you can find somebody who doesn't fall within that spectrum, I'd like to see it. I mean, I'm sure if you go through everything that was written, you'll find 0.1% that doesn't accept it. But it's virtually unanimous. And it doesn't matter if you're a well-educated intellectual that Bush and Blair are also, while they're proclaiming the Messianic vision, they are also saying we're among the most brazen liars in history because we drove you into war with the claim that the single question was weapons of mass destruction. But it's really the Messianic vision. And the standard bearer of the Messianic vision, the one who's hailed in the press as, the liberal press, I'm just keeping to that, as idealist in chief, a man who just has a passion for democracy, is Paul Wolfowitz, who in fact demonstrated his passion for democracy immediately before the war. Right before the war, you'll recall, this is not ancient history, Donald Rumsfeld made a distinction between what he called old Europe and new Europe. Okay, and everybody immediately jumped on that bandwagon. Old Europe are the bad guys, the ones who are interfering, can't get on the boat, and so on and so forth. New Europe are the great hope for democracy, the great hope for the future, like Berlusconi and Aznar. I mean, that's the hope for the future. Aznar particularly. In fact, he was even invited to join Bush and Blair at the Azores meeting announcing the war. There was a very sharp criterion that distinguished old Europe from new Europe, remarkably sharp. You don't find this in a complicated world. So it takes real discipline not to see it. The distinction was old Europe were the countries where the governments took the position of the overwhelming majority of the population. New Europe were the countries where the government overruled an even larger majority of the population and took their orders from Crawford, Texas. So in the case of Aznar, he literally had the support of 2% of the population. But he was a leader of the great new Europe and the hope for democracy because he was doing what he was told. Okay, now, to miss that takes discipline. You have to admire the educational system for being able to create people capable of missing that. What about Wolfowitz? Well, the most extreme example, and the most interesting one, was Turkey. To everyone's amazement, including mine, know something about Turkey, the Turkish government actually took the position of 95% of the population and didn't join the war. Well, they were bitterly denounced here. I mean, Powell immediately, as the moderate said, we're going to cut off all aid to Turkey and so on. Press denounced them, everybody denounced them. Wolfowitz went beyond. He actually berated the Turkish military for permitting the government to follow the will of 95% of the population, and he ordered them to apologize to America and understand that their task is to help America. So he is the idealist in chief with a passion for democracy that can't be, we just have to go breathless over. And in fact, it fits his background. He was the strongest supporter of President Suharto of Indonesia, who is certainly comparable to Saddam Hussein, one of the worst murderers and torturers of the last half century. Wolfowitz supported him not only when he was ambassador, when he's ordered to do it, but long afterwards. In fact, he supported him after the population had overthrown him. And he's still supporting him, saying how he, we can't overlook the fact that he did some reconstruction in Indonesia, just as Saddam Hussein did in Iraq, and just as Hitler did in Germany, and so on. Find somebody who didn't. So that's the idealist in chief. Well, actually, the unanimity was not total, I have to admit. In the middle of, just after the president gave an inspiring speech in Washington on his messianic vision, I think it was November 2003, the Washington Post did run a poll which criticized the which broke the irregularity. It was a poll in Baghdad. People in Baghdad were asked why they thought the United States invaded Iraq. And there were some who agreed with 100% of Western intellectual commentary. 1%. 1% said it was to bring democracy. 5% said it was to help Iraqis. Almost everybody else said what's completely obvious if you haven't had a good education. The United States invaded Iraq to take control of Iraq's resources. Yeah, obviously. That's why they invaded Iraq and not some other place. That's why they were supporting Saddam. That's why they prevented any overthrow of Saddam. And it's very consistent. So now can they control Iraq's resources? Well, that brings us up to the present. What about Carruthers' strong line of continuity? Is it continuing? Yeah, it's continuing. There was an election in Iraq, and personally, I think, I applaud it. I mean, I applaud Iraqis who went to the polls. They should have. What was the U.S. attitude toward the elections? The U.S. tried in every imaginable way to prevent the elections. It went right through almost to the end. In fact, I have a book that came out last summer in which I was just quoting the press, New York Times, which was reporting accurately U.S. efforts to undermine any potential election, because they were concerned that if there was an election, any kind of elected government might call on the U.S. forces to leave. And the U.S. obviously can't accept that, so they had to do everything possible to stop an election, caucus system, write a constitution, anything you can dream up. Well, they weren't able to succeed, which is quite remarkable. And if we had anything remotely resembling a free press, there would be headlines lauding the Iraqi people for a tremendous victory of nonviolent resistance. The U.S. doesn't care about the suicide bombers. I mean, the arena of violence, the U.S. has such overwhelming force, it's going to win. In fact, suicide bombers are kind of a help. What they can't deal with, and no imperial power can deal with, is nonviolent mass popular resistance. That's hard to deal with. And the Sistani was kind of the symbol for it, but he was able. They brought out big demonstrations and just refusal to accept the illegal Bremer laws, which were opening up Iraq to the Western takeover. Action after action made it clear to Bush's handlers that they're going to have to permit an election. Well, by the time they realized that, they of course took credit for the election. Right, that's normal. And the press and intellectuals immediately switched into that mode, praising the United States for bringing about the election that they had tried in every possible way to prevent. And that then comes, what do you do about it? Well, you have to somehow subvert it. And if you read the business press, they tell the truth. Like the Wall Street Journal had an article right around the time of the election saying, it's kind of tricky, they're going to have this election. So we have to, and in fact, every political party, even the U.S. candidate, Alawi, even his party, had to have a plank in it calling for withdrawal, because that's what people were voting for. But the journal pointed out that the U.S. will work in some fashion to ensure that Iraqis are satisfied with what he called vague promises for withdrawal. So, okay, yeah, maybe they're voting for withdrawal, but we'll manipulate the political class and, plenty of power. I mean, after all, got an occupying army. You've got all the, after having destroyed the country, you have all the economic force that's capable of somehow rebuilding a society. So this, and political classes are totally corrupt anyway most of the time, and not hard to buy off everywhere here too. So yes, it's a good chance that they can somehow coerce the political leadership into accepting vague promises for withdrawal. And to make sure that there wouldn't be any problems in the election, the U.S. forced out the one element of the free press, namely Al Jazeera, which is the one independent press. Got to make sure that they're not there, just like they had to bomb them out of Kabul and bomb them out of Baghdad and so on, because you can't allow a free press around because it might report the wrong thing, especially since people are looking at it. So they were kicked out. The U.S. candidate was given every possible advantage, total access to state television, all the resources, but he got creamed. In fact, isn't even technically in the cabinet. So now they've got this situation. They have succeeded in Exactly how, I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. But one way or another, the formal political leadership has backed off of the election promises to say what the Wall Street Journal wanted, vague promises of ultimate withdrawal, despite what the population voted for. Whether nonviolent resistance will permit this or not, we'll see. But it's pretty clear what the U.S. wants. It's almost inconceivable that the U.S. could permit a sovereign democratic Iraq. I mean, it's about as close to inconceivable as anything you can imagine. And again, the reasons are transparent. I mean, simply ask yourself what the policies of a sovereign democratic Iraq would be. Okay? First of all, it'll be, if it's at all minimally democratic, there'll be a Shiite majority. So they'll have a significant voice in what happens. Well, they're not madly in love with Iran by any means, but they'd rather have a friendly neighbor than a hostile neighbor. So they'll mend fences with Iran, as was already happening before the invasion. So you'll have some sort of, coexistence, at least, maybe more, between Shiite Iran and Shiite Iraq. Furthermore, there's a Shiite population in the northern part of Saudi Arabia, which happens to be where all the oil is. And they're already stirring, not thanks to Bush, but thanks to Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden probably has been the greatest recent democratizing force in the Middle East, aside from Al Jazeera. The 9/11 had an effect in the Arab world. In Saudi Arabia, for example, the most tyrannical country, it made them recognize they're going to have to allow some leeway to these reform movements that have been going on forever that the U.S. has been crushing. And they did, a little, So there was some stirrings and the slight moves towards some kind of autonomy in the Shiite regions of northern Saudi Arabia, where most of the oil is. And if Iraq becomes independent, that's only going to increase. And you can see looming ahead a Shiite alliance controlling most of the world's energy. Okay, this is no joke. I mean, ExxonMobil, which is very conservative about these things and never talks about peak oil, just produced their 25-year projection. And to everyone's surprise, in the oil system, they projected that in 5 years, which is no time, non-OPEC oil is going to peak. Meaning, and they went on, that means that even more than before, the U.S. is going to have to rely not for access so much as for control over OPEC oil, which means primarily the Gulf region, which means primarily what would be under an independent mostly Shiite alliance outside of U.S. control if Iraq were to become sovereign. I mean, the chance of the U.S. allowing this is about like an asteroid hitting the Earth tomorrow. And it doesn't end there. I mean, Iraq is the major country in the Arab world, historically, back to biblical times. And it's going to try to regain that position, as it should. Well, you regain that position, first thing you got to do is confront the regional enemy. So they're going to have to rearm. And probably develop weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent. One thing that the U.S. invasion of Iraq taught everyone is you better have weapons of mass destruction if you want to protect yourself from a U.S. attack. I mean, that was a very clear lesson. Again, it takes brilliance not to see it. And it was predicted in advance that by strategic analysts and others that the invasion is going to cause proliferation, just as it's going to cause terror, as it did. So yes, Iraq will probably develop weapons of mass destruction to confront Israel and to deter the United States. So here we have a situation emerging in a democratic sovereign Iraq where the world's oil supplies are controlled by independent Shiite alliance, which is rearming, developing weapons of mass destruction, pursuing its own interests. Which means, perfectly happy to make deals with China and anybody who wants to come in, and not allowing the United States to control the world's oil system, which has been a primary goal of U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War. And notice the word control. I mean, if the U.S. was running on solar power, the policies wouldn't change. And you can see that. I mean, for the first several decades after the Second World War, the U.S. wasn't using any Middle East oil. In fact, it was North America was the major oil producer and exporter. But didn't change anything. The U.S. had to control Middle East oil, and it has to control it now. And the reasons are the same. And the smarter people tell you, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's one of the more astute of the top planners, pointed out recently that he wasn't in favor of the invasion, but he says it's true that the U.S. invasion of Iraq has an upside. It gives the United States, if the U.S. can stay there, it gives the U.S. what he called critical leverage over its enemies, namely Europe and Asia, European and Asian economies. You get critical leverage over them if you have your hand on the spigot. Yeah, that's true. He's actually repeating what George Kennan said during the days when he was a top planner, back around late 40s, that control over Middle East oil gives the United States veto power over what might be done by other industrial countries, Europe and Japan when they reconstruct. And that's correct. But according to this scenario, we're imagining the U.S. would lose that. So it would lose critical leverage over European and Asian economies. The world's energy system would be in independent and maybe hostile hands. They'd be facing a rearmed Iraq, maybe with weapons of mass destruction. Is the U.S. going to sit by and allow this? I mean, that's a democratic vision, okay? I mean, the chances are like zero. In fact, if you want to see how much close to zero it is, just read every day's newspapers. So I didn't see this morning, so I can't cite it, but yesterday's New York Times, or one of them, explained that at the non-proliferation treaty meetings in New York right now, which are extremely important and are being totally misreported. I'll get back to that if you want. But they said that the U.S. representative made it clear that they want the NPT modified to prevent Iran from doing what's legal, namely developing, doing uranium enrichment for nuclear energy, and what the U.S. supported when the Shah was doing it. They want to prevent them from doing it now, because pretty soon there's going to be an election, and it's very popular in Iran, and if there's an election, people will vote for it. So because of our messianic commitment to democracy, we've got to make sure that we block this before people have a chance to carry out a democratic vote. In other words, the strong line of continuity again. And it shows up everywhere you look. Like, for example, when Yasser Arafat died, big talk all over the place about how finally we have a chance to fulfill our passionate wish for democracy because they can have an election in Palestine. Well, there was a front page article on it in the New York Times by Stephen Erlanger, who's no fool. The first paragraph, big front page think piece, first paragraph, front page says, with the death of Arafat, the U.S. can now carry out, I think what he called it, its quintessential vision, belief that free elections legitimate even the frailest of institutions. That's paragraph 1. You go down to the continuation page, where the interesting news usually is, in the last paragraph. The last paragraph, you should always read the New York Times from back up, because the interesting stuff, literally, I'm not joking, the interesting stuff is at the end, where the writer assumes that the editors aren't going to notice it, and where the headline writers, they only look at the first paragraph. So at the last paragraph, in the continuation page, it says, there's a kind of a paradox. The U.S. was always opposed to allowing elections in Palestine because they knew Arafat was going to win. Okay, so that tells you what the quintessential vision is. Elections are wonderful if and only if they support our strategic and economic objectives. In other words, the same strong line of continuity. Okay? Thomas Carruthers happens, just to finish, to have, he's mainly a Latin American scholar, and he was in the Reagan State Department running democracy enhancement programs for Latin America in the 1980s. And he wrote the standard scholarly work on democracy enhancement in the 1980s. What did he discover? Same strong line of continuity. He says Reagan administration was schizophrenic, same pathology, where it had influence, it blocked democracy. Where it couldn't control things, it allowed democracy. So he says democracy succeeded in the southern cone, southern cone of the hemisphere, where the U.S. had very little influence. There was progress toward democracy. And nearby, the traditional place where the U.S. boot is heavily placed, and where the U.S. was carrying out massive terrorist wars in the 80s, he said there was no progress for democracy, and he even explains why. He says because the United States was willing to accept only top-down forms of democracy run by traditional elites who retained close connections with U.S. power. Yeah. Same strong line of continuity. Actually, everyone talks these days, it's considered de rigueur these days to talk about the U.S. experience in bringing democracy to Japan and Europe after World War II. I would urge you to take a look at that. Yes, the U.S. brought democracy, but with the same strong line of continuity. In fact, the first actions of the U.S. and British forces everywhere were to destroy the resistance, to destroy the anti-fascist resistance, to smash the labor movement, to undermine areas that had been taken over by the resistance and were already being run by their own population, and to reinstitute the traditional, mostly quasi-fascist order. But of course in a form subordinate to U.S. power. That runs through country after country, plenty of mainstream scholarship on it. Don't take my word for it. It's good summaries if you want. So yes, the same strong line of continuity. Is there anything surprising about it? Not at all. It just says the United States acts like every other power. Yeah, sure. I mean, Luxembourg would do it if they had the power. That's the way power systems operate. So the conclusion is the United States is like everybody else. Last comment, what about the U.S. population? The U.S. population is strongly opposed to all of this. In fact, watching those cartoons, I was struck by how close they are to the overwhelming majority of opinion in the United States. And the comment about the United States not being a democratic society is exactly correct. Public opinion in the United States has almost no impact on policy. And you can see it in these cases and many others. So, for example, the U.S. public is strongly opposed to the bipartisan consensus on preemptive war. Strongly opposed. A large majority of the public takes a pretty traditional view of the UN Charter. Countries allowed to use force only if it's authorized by the Security Council, or if it is in imminent danger of attack. If there's an imminent threat of attack, like tomorrow, we've got to do something before the Security Council acts. Well, that's traditional interpretation of Article 51 of the Charter, recently reaffirmed in December 2004 by a high-level commission, and it agrees with the large majority of the public. Overwhelming majority of the public thinks that the UN ought to take the lead, not the United States, in international crises, including reconstruction, security, and political transition in Iraq. I mean, that's been the position of the large majority of the U.S. public since about April 2003. Here we might compare the United States with another country, the leader of New Europe, the Hope for Democracy, Aznar, with 2% of the support, but following Bush's orders. Well, a year after that, the Spanish population voted him out of office. And they were bitterly denounced for appeasing terror and this, that, and the other thing. Actually, what Spanish voters voted for happened to be the position of about 70% of the American public. Nobody mentioned that. What Spanish voters voted for was to maintain troops in Iraq only if they were under UN supervision and control, which happened to be the position of 70% of the American population. But in Spain, people are aware of public opinion. Here, you got to do a research project to find it out. And in Spain, people could vote on it. Here, it's inconceivable. Couldn't be in the election. It didn't come up, and so on. And that's true on issue after issue. That's a big problem here. We have a problem of democracy promotion, but it's mostly here. And unless it's carried out here, the rest of the world and us, we're all going to be in deep trouble. This is only one example.
title of this series of talks has been Reconstructing Iraq, and I think a large body of the audience consists of architects and planners, and one can assume that if they are here, they're generally people of goodwill. What do you think are the conditions under which the reconstruction of Iraq is taking place?
What they should be or what they are?
Yeah.
What
they are now.
Well, what they are is it's the strong line of continuity, obviously. I mean, the U.S. is going to try to run it as much as possible. And we know what that'll mean. You can read Bremer's orders. Okay, tells you what it's going to mean. It means opening up Iraq to virtually total control by U.S. and secondarily British corporations. Plenty of examples around the world. This is an extreme case because the orders are extremely harsh. Totally illegal, but extremely harsh. The Iraqis don't want them. Even the Iraqi businessmen were complaining about them, obviously, because it's going to put them out of business, except for those who remain clients of foreign corporations. That's what is going to happen unless Iraqis block it, and unless we block it. What should happen? Well, you know, it's not for me to decide. It's for Iraqis to decide. What should be done is, as quickly as possible, implement the messianic vision, which nobody believes in, and let the decisions be in the hands of Iraqis. I mean, I don't know what they'll do. I probably won't like what they'll decide, but what's that got to do with it? You know, it's not my country. So they have to decide what they want to do. The U.S. should not be providing aid, in my opinion. It should be providing reparations, massive reparations, not just for the invasion. It should be providing reparations for having strongly supported Saddam Hussein right through his worst atrocities. You know, they knew all about him. Long after the war with Iran, that wasn't the reason. And then supporting him again in April, March 1991, after the first Gulf War, when there was a rebellion in Iraq, which probably would have overthrown him if the United States hadn't authorized Saddam to use aircraft and so on to crush the rebellion. And now, you know, if you're Thomas Friedman and so on, you talk about how you can't stand looking at the mass graves. It makes your heart pained and so on and so forth. You look at what Thomas Friedman was writing then and his colleagues, it was a little different. They were saying, well, you know, too bad that all this monstrous destruction is going on, but there's a consensus among the U.S. and its allies that Saddam Hussein offers more hope for the stability of his country and the region than those who are trying to overthrow him. That's New York Times correspondent Alan Cowell. Thomas Friedman, he says, well, you know, the best of all worlds for the United States, he said, would be an iron-fisted military junta that would rule Iraq the same way Saddam did, much to the pleasure of U.S. allies. That would be the best of all worlds. Well, we can't quite get that, so we'll have to settle for Saddam. Okay, that's more reparations. Then come 10 years of sanctions, which we're not allowed to talk about. They're called UN sanctions, but that's nonsense. They're U.S. sanctions. UN would never have accepted them if the U.S. didn't force them through, with Britain toddling along behind like they're supposed to do. So it's U.S. sanctions, which devastated the country, you know, killed hundreds of thousands of people, devastated the civilian society, compelled people to rely on Saddam just for survival. If it hadn't been for that, the Iraqis themselves probably would have sent Saddam the same way, you know, on the same train as Suharto and Ceausescu and Marcos and a whole bunch of other monsters who the folks in Washington were supporting, many of them just as bad as Saddam and just as murderous, supported to the last minute. He probably would have been gone too. That's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of the Westerners who knew more about Iraq than anyone else in the West, which is why they were kept out of the U.S. press totally, namely the two coordinators of the Oil for Food program, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, and in fact their successor, respected international diplomats who resigned in protest because, as how they put it, the sanctions were just genocidal. And both of them thought, you know, they had people going all over Iraq. They had a lot of information. Obviously, they didn't know it as well as Iraqis did, and they obviously knew it better than the CIA did, but so did my cat, as it turns out. But better than any Westerners, at least. And that was their opinion, which is not unreasonable. That's what's happened in other countries. But in our judgment, it doesn't even matter. I mean, unless we give them a chance to do it, we have nothing to do. So we got to pay them reparations for the sanctions, for the support of Saddam Hussein when he crushed the rebellion, for the support of Saddam Hussein in the preceding years. We can go back to the U.S. involvement in putting him in the first place, and certainly for the effect of the invasion. I mean, that's what reparations are for, for carrying out atrocities against someone. So that's what we ought to be doing. That's what ought to be done. In the short term, administration of all of this should be put in the hand. Here I agree with the large majority of the American population, and I presume Iraqis. In the short term, administration of this should be in the hands of the United Nations, and that means the General Assembly, which has authority, not the Security Council, where the U.S. can veto things. And they should be handing it all over to Iraqis as soon as possible, with the U.S. paying reparations for the crimes of the last 30 years. That's what should be done. And how Iraqis will decide to reconstruct their country, it's up to them.
Mr. Chomsky, one more question if you need to give.
Yeah. Nancy?
Could I ask you just to say something about the bases that the U.S. is developing, not just in Iraq, which I believe they're obviously doing it, but elsewhere, and also if you could shed any light on why Saudi Arabia is thinking of developing nuclear power.
Of moving to nuclear?
Nuclear power.
Well, Saudi Arabia moving there? That I haven't heard, but...
No, they have a program, and there was just a little thing about it.
Yeah, there may be. Well, it's not. That wouldn't be surprising. U.S. policy has always been that U.S. allies, including the oil-producing states, should develop nuclear power. Like Iran under the Shah, the U.S. was supporting and, in fact, assisting him in developing uranium enrichment facilities, allegedly for nuclear power, though everybody knows they can be used for nuclear weapons. Actually, Henry Kissinger was asked about this recently. He was asked, why did you support Iran's quest for nuclear power in the 1970s while you claim now that they don't need nuclear power? And he was quiet for a minute, but then he gave an honest answer, as he usually does. He said, well, then the Shah was our man. Our tyrant was running Iran. Now it's somebody we don't like. So what could be simpler? You have to admire him for his honesty. But as far as the bases are concerned, it's kept under a cloud. There are reports that the U.S. is building 14 bases in Iraq. The reporters can't go anywhere. They're stuck in the green zone. There's a few independent. They know less about Iraq than anybody, just as most of the diplomats do. I mean, what you see in the green zone, you can see on CNN from here. They have a couple of Iraqi stringers, brave people who go out. But, anybody who knows anything about foreign reporting, anything, knows that stringers are usually in the pay of half a dozen intelligence agencies. And they're telling you what those intelligence agencies or other forces want you to hear. That's why reporters don't rely on stringers if they have a choice. In Iraq, they don't have much of a choice. It's not that they're cowards or anything. It's that the U.S. has created such a catastrophe that people can't get out of the green zone without being followed by 2 Abrams tanks. It's the worst military catastrophe in military history. Germany had much less trouble in occupied Europe, literally. Occupied Europe was quiet. It was run by local people. German troops in the background, but, rarely did anything. The Russians ran Eastern Europe with, again, Russian troops in the background, but it was the local people who ran everything. The politics, the security, everything. Amazingly, in what should have been the easiest military conquest in history, the U.S. has created a total catastrophe, and it's just too dangerous for people to move. So we don't know what's happening with those bases. It could be that they're there for the current troops. Everyone's guess is they're probably intended to be permanent. But the U.S. has established a network of bases all everywhere. I mean, after the bombing of Serbia, with, again, totally fraudulent claims. I mean, by now they're conceded to be fraudulent. The U.S. did end up with one of its biggest military bases in the world in Kosovo, Camp Bondsteel, which happens to be right on an oil transition route. And there's bases in Central Asia, you know, in Uzbekistan, another one of those great democratic countries, and everywhere else. I mean, they had to move them out of Saudi Arabia thanks to Osama bin Laden. That's one point that Paul Wolfowitz made, which is correct. I said we can't keep the bases in Saudi Arabia because it's just going to stir up too much terror and violence and so on, so we got to move them somewhere else, the Gulf Emirates, Iraq, someplace. But the network of bases surrounding the region is extraordinary. I mean, it always has been, but it's being built up even further. Remember that the bases include Turkey, crucially, that's always been the prime U.S. ally in the region, and Israel, which is now an offshore U.S. military base virtually. I mean, it's not advertised much, but Israel, which is a small country on its own, can't do anything, but as a U.S. client, has air and armored forces which are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power, apart from the U.S. Furthermore, in the last year, the Bush administration has sent over 100 its most advanced jet bombers to Israel, very openly announced. They don't want to keep it secret. Openly announced as being capable of bombing Iran. And as they point out, the updated versions are the ones that Israel used to bomb Iraq, the Osirak reactor. It's not mentioned here that the bombing of the Osirak reactor didn't end Saddam's nuclear weapons program. It initiated it. The reactor that was bombed was inspected immediately afterwards by the head of Harvard's physics department, who's a specialist on nuclear reactors, who wrote an article about it in Nature, the world's leading science journal, in which he pointed out that this reactor can't possibly be used for nuclear weapons, had a different design, and so on. We know from Iraqi defectors who were working there that right after that they got an order to start working on nuclear weapons. Yeah, naturally, it's a deterrent. So the bombing initiated the nuclear weapons program, which the U.S. and Britain then accelerated. And these announcements, this is a large part of the Israeli Air Force, nobody knows how much, is based in eastern Turkey, in the U.S. bases there, carrying out reconnaissance, at least over at the Iranian border. And this is, Turkey and Israel alone is a huge military force, and the rest of the bases are for the world superpower, completely surrounding the region. I mean, if you think about it for a minute, by U.S. standards, by our official standards, Iran ought to be carrying out major terrorist acts in the United States now. Think it through. The doctrine of the Bush administration is the doctrine of preventive war. If anyone threatens you, you have a right to carry out actions to block that threat, even if the threat is in a distance. Well, the threat to Iran isn't in a distance. It's immediate. They're under imminent threat of attack by the world superpower and its clients. So by our standards, they ought to be bombing the United States. Well, they can't do that, so they ought to be carrying out terrorist acts in the United States. And if they did it, we ought to be applauding them, at least if we approve the doctrines we're supposed to be accepting. Well, nobody's going to applaud that, but that tells you something about the doctrines. And again, it tells you something about the world in which we live, the dominant intellectual community in the United States, Cambridge, Harvard and MIT. And we're not talking about some exotic tribe in Papua New Guinea, We're talking about right where we live and the culture that dominates here. And this is its character. If we can't see it, we've really got blinders on.
Okay,
I gotta go.